We should never allow the government to decide what is acceptable speech and what is unacceptable speech. We should penalize behaviors, not opinions, and not speech. If you start trying to regulate speech, you start trying to regulate thoughts, you start trying to regulate beliefs rather than behaviors, there's no way that you're not going to abridge the constitutional rights of millions of Americans.
What's different about the Obama administration is the sheer number of radical people he's assembled at very high levels.
Obama is probably the most radical president that has ever sat in the White House.
By all standards, Barack Obama has surrounded himself with probably the most radical group of advisors of any previous administration in American history.
Since taking office in January 2009, President Barack Obama has made a number of high-level controversial appointments.
These people have very radical backgrounds. They're bent on socialist policies. There's really no other way to describe it.
Robert Knight, Washington correspondent for Coral Ridge Ministries, is the author of the explosive new book, Radical Rulers, the White House Elites Who Are Pushing America Toward Socialism.
You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to see a pattern. If nominee after nominee has a radical track record and of leftist views, something is not right.
You know, Ronald Reagan said personnel is policy, and President Obama is really implementing that. He is choosing people who will radically change America.
Dr. Janice Shaw Krause is the senior fellow at the Beverly LaHaye Institute at Concerned Women for America.
I don't think the electorate realized that when President Obama talked about hope and change, that he meant to fundamentally change our government.
Some of the nominees or appointees had surfaced as hardcore liberals, but when you scratched a little deeper, you found out they had actual socialist and communist connections.
For people to think, well, this is just bad vetting, I think that's very naive.
Dr. Gary Cass is the president of the Christian Anti-Defamation Commission.
We must assume that the people that are coming into the highest levels of our government are not coming in there arbitrarily. These people are known.
One example is Carol Browner, the president's climate change czar.
She was a member of the Socialist International. She was a member of an elite board governing environmental issues at the Socialist International. That's the big S socialism. And here she's instrumental in setting environmental policy for the United States. Van Jones was the president's green jobs czar. He was in charge of coming up with ways people could be employed through alternative energy development. He didn't last long because he was outed as a communist, card-carrying, capital C communist. He had to resign, but reports have surfaced that he's still sitting in on meetings, he's still advising. Anita Dunn is another appointee who didn't last very long. She was the communications director for the White House. And shortly after, a videotape surfaced of her giving a commencement speech in which she praised Mao Zedong as one of her two favorite philosophers.
The third lesson and tip actually come from two of my favorite political philosophers, Mao Zedong and Mother Teresa.
It was just startling to think that such a high-ranking member of the administration would have anything favorable to say about Chairman Mao, the communist leader that murdered millions and millions of his own people.
One of the earliest appointments, and most shocking, was John Holdren as science czar.
Holdren authored a 1973 textbook with population control advocates Paul and Ann Ehrlich, in which they said, quote, "Redistribution of wealth, both within and among nations, is absolutely essential if a decent life is to be provided for every human being," unquote.
Holdren and these other authors wrote a book in which they floated the idea of putting birth control agents in drinking water and actually mandating abortions to keep the population down. And they wrote that this was probably doable under our Constitution.
Good afternoon, everyone.
There have also been troubling appointments on more than one front.
Along with a radical economic agenda, the administration has brought people in that propose a radical social agenda.
Currently, one of the most controversial appointees is a woman who was formerly a man. And I've heard people say, well, it's not a big deal. Well, if you care about children, it is a big deal, because this woman has a 15-year-old son. What in the world does he say about the fact that his father is now a woman? How does he deal with that?
Another nominee is lesbian activist and law professor Kai Feldblum to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
This woman has openly endorsed polygamous marriage. In addition to that, she has said her goal is for gays to win and Christians to lose. Astounding. I mean, these are people who've taken positions that are no secret.
When Kai Feldblum was being nominated, she had to go through some hearings, and in those hearings, when asked, did she ever see a situation where religious liberty and religious issues would trump homosexual rights, she said she couldn't imagine in any situation when religious liberties would prevail. Therefore, the rights of homosexuals prevail against the rights of religious people in her world.
I think the most shocking appointment of all has been Kevin Jennings, the founder of GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, a radical group promoting homosexuality in the schools, to be the Safe Schools Czar. That's putting the wolf in the chicken house. Here's a guy who's been promoting homosexuality. His group has been caught distributing booklets with obscene material in them, urging kids to do things I can't even describe here. He's given very bad advice himself when he was a teacher as a counselor to a 15-year-old boy who'd had a sexual encounter with a man, not dissuading him in the least, just telling him, I hope you used a condom. This is not the kind of guy you want designing safe school programs.
President Obama is appointing an unprecedented number of people to czar positions which require no Senate confirmation. Nobody knows who's being appointed. They are appointed under the radar, so we as a public have no say-so.
But despite the radical new direction of the nation, there is reason for hope.
There's one big piece of good news amid all this, and that's Americans are waking up to the fact that they're in the grip of a very radical administration and a radical Congress, and they're doing something about it. We should take heart, especially Christians who know that God is in control at all times, that God will favor those who honor God, and that we don't have to have a huge majority to make effective change come about. God honors those who honor Him, and we should never lose hope.
As we just saw, Robert Knight of Coral Ridge Ministries has written the book on President Obama's radical rulers, and he's joining us now for the rest of the program. Bob, welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jerry.
So as I was reading the book, which by the way is a great book.
Thanks.
It's very shocking though, and I thought, how could a U.S. president surround himself with such radical appointees?
The short answer is the media. They didn't inform the American people as to Obama's true agenda, nor did they vet the various appointees he has put in office. Take Van Jones, for instance. Nobody knew he was a communist until after he resigned. It had to be discovered by a New Zealand blogger who uncovered his communist credentials. Also, it came out he was a truther, a guy who believed in the conspiracy theory that the Bush administration caused 9/11 to pull us into a war. The Washington Post knew about this. It had been reported on the blogs, and Glenn Beck had it on his program for a week. And the Post didn't write any stories about it until after Van Jones resigned. Now, to me, that shows complicity. The idea that the media are so protective of this president because he shares many of their ideological goals of more government that they're unwilling to report the facts to the American people.
But the thing I don't understand is so many Americans put their trust in Barack Obama and were really hopeful about his presidency. Do you think they had any idea about this radical agenda?
If the figures don't lie, the surveys show that Americans have changed their views of Obama, and the people who once believed that he was a centrist, a moderate, a bargainer who could bring parties together, now believe that he's a divisive, leftist, polarizing, big government, big spending president. And they don't like what he's doing anymore.
Do you think these radical rulers that are highlighted in your book, and it's just incredible how many there are they typical of all the appointees of President Obama?
Well, the cream rises to the top. And since people are policy, you put people in charge of key places who will carry out the agenda you want. These people are in charge of hundreds, if not thousands, of other federal employees. If they start out with a radical agenda, of course they're going to appoint people below them who have similar radical views. That's why I think there are a lot more books to be written on how radical this administration is.
Now, one thing I don't understand is the phenomenon of czars. And I know President Obama didn't invent the idea. There have been previous presidents, including Republicans, that have had czars, but I don't see how that fits with the Constitution.
Well, some of these czars are constitutional. They are offices that are vetted by the Senate that gives advice and consent. Others are not. They're created positions specifically to go around the Senate. Van Jones was one of them, the Green Job Czar. Of course, his official title wasn't Green Job Czar, but he reported to the president directly. And you have something like 34 of these people, some of them vetted, some of them not, by the Senate. And no one has appointed more of these than Barack Obama has.
Now, having written this book, if you had to isolate one individual who was the most radical of the radical rulers, who would that be?
That's easy. That would be Kevin Jennings. He's the Safe Schools Czar in the Department of Education, but he also founded GLSEN, which has been promoting homosexuality to school kids for years.
Well, we have prepared a special report on Kevin Jennings. Let's take a closer look.
For 20 years, I've heard a very common refrain by people who know me. Kevin, you're too impatient. Kevin, you want change too fast. Well, you know what? That's all true.
This is Kevin Jennings, the Obama administration's pick to lead the Office of Safe and Drug-Free Schools for the Department of Education. At this 2007 event, Jennings is passing on the leadership of GLSEN, the organization he founded as a high school teacher and ran for 18 years. GLSEN stands for the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network.
There's no question Kevin Jennings is a radical.
Janice Shaw Krause, Executive Director of the Beverly LaHaye Institute, the think tank for Concerned Women for America.
Kevin Jennings lives for one purpose, and I know him well enough to say this. His whole career has been devoted to mainstreaming homosexuality and creating a culture that is not just accepting of, but approving of homosexual behavior, particularly amongst preteens and teenagers.
Janice Shaw Krause sat beside Jennings for 2 years on a Surgeon General's task force on sex education. She recounts the story of Jennings' disturbing advice to a 15-year-old student.
A student, reported to be 15, talked to teacher Jennings and said to him that he had been approached by an adult man in a bus stop with whom he had sex. Jennings' advice was, I hope you used a condom and had safe sex. This is against the law, number one. Number two, it's unconscionable that a teacher would give that kind of advice to a student. And this is the man who's supposed to be providing safe schools for our kids.
Kevin Jennings has no business even being near a school, much less in charge of the federal government's Safe Schools program.
Robert Knight, Washington, D.C. correspondent for Coral Ridge Ministries and author of Radical Rulers.
If you wonder where Kevin Jennings gets his worldview, he said himself he was inspired by people including Harry Hay. Harry Hay was one of the founders of the Mattachine Society, the first gay rights group, and he was a strong supporter of the North American Man-Boy Love Association, which is a pedophile group that supports men having sex with boys.
Kevin Jennings has been part of an organization, GLSEN, where he has advocated safe sex kits that include instructions for fisting. I don't think it takes much imagination to imagine what that's all about. Emergency rooms are filled with people who are engaging in that type of behavior. And for President Obama to appoint a man who advocates that kind of behavior and says that this is something that ought to be protected with America's school children is beyond the pale.
In fact, the foreword to the book Queering Elementary Education was written by none other than Safe School czar Kevin Jennings. In March of 2004, 7-year-old Olivia Hartzell, a first grader at Freeman Elementary School, checked out a book that appears on the approved list for her advanced reading class. The book was King and King, a book Olivia thought was a fairy tale.
As we do every night with my daughter, she was reading a book, and I'm standing there kind of cleaning up, listening to her read. The book took a turn, just really went somewhere that we didn't expect it to.
The book depicts a prince who rejects a number of potential princesses before finally falling in love with another prince.
Mike and I both looked at each other and was just surprised. And we explained to her that we did not want her to read this kind of book. And we both just went outside and had to take a breath. And I just sat on the steps and just cried because I was surprised.
Brian Kamaker was also surprised when he got an angry phone call from Kevin Jennings himself.
Kevin Jennings called me at home. I think it was in 1997 or 1998 when our group, Parents' Rights Coalition, was going to picket one of their events in a high school, their events for kids and teachers. He obviously got so angry at this idea that he yelled and screamed at me. And they didn't want any bad publicity, I guess, but they ended up getting some.
Kevin Jennings needs to be replaced. He needs to be replaced today.
Though members of Congress and pro-family groups have called for Jennings' resignation, the administration has so far taken no action.
The Obama administration has sort of thumbed its nose at all of us. And I think the American public is saying in this new year, we have to do something about that.
I think you're going to see a huge increase in the number of people of faith coming forward and making their presence known in the public square.
In 2012, you're going to see a real outcry at the polling booths.
In the meantime, Kevin Jennings' advice to his GLSEN successor suggests his own time frame for radicalizing our schools.
Be impatient. Demand change now.
Wow. Well, Bob, I don't see how that makes the schools any more safe.
It doesn't, and that's a very sad thing.
Now, one thing you point out in your book and I think this is really important, is that while homosexuality, of course, is a sin, and what Kevin Jennings is promoting is wrong and is leading people astray, but you also point out that through the gospel of Jesus Christ, people have and can be changed from that sin as well as many others.
Oh, that's right. In 1 Corinthians, Paul lists a group of sins that will keep you out of heaven. But then he says, but such were some of you. And he had listed homosexuality in the previous list. So he's saying clearly that people are afflicted with all sorts of temptations. And when they act out on them, they're displeasing God. But there is a way out through the grace of Jesus Christ.
Now, one thing Kevin Jennings said just a moment ago was, demand change now. Does that come from the Saul Alinsky playbook?
It's right out of the Saul Alinsky playbook, because Saul Alinsky, in Rules for Radicals, said that you have to stir things up. That's what community organizers do. And to get any change, you have to become an agitator and demand change, even when your opponents are coming your way. And he has several anecdotes in the book that are fascinating about how some people try to appease demonstrators, and he would have none of it. And he said, no, you got to pound the desk, you got to scream at them, you got to scare them. You've got to teach them a lesson that will further the issue and make it and blow it up even when you're getting what you want.
Well, we have prepared a special report on Saul Alinsky, who could be described as the radical mentor to the radical rulers.
Saul Alinsky, who lived from 1909 to 1972, was a community organizer from Chicago long before Barack Obama was. In fact, he wrote the book for community organizers, a book called Rules for Radicals, published in 1971, which he dedicates to an unusual individual.
Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky is dedicated to Lucifer. That the dedication page says, to the first one who rebelled against the establishment and won his own kingdom, Lucifer.
A committed Marxist, Alinsky grew up in a rough part of Chicago and worked hard to implement social justice as he understood it. He believed that the end justified the means. Author and speaker William J. Federer.
This idea that Saul Alinsky adopted is the end, your agenda, you're convinced is so good, any means necessary to get there is okay. Lying, voter fraud, intimidation, bribery, threats, anything. Matter of fact, one of the rules says that you hold your opponent to a higher level of moral conduct, where your only level of moral conduct is whatever it takes to win.
President Barack Hussein Obama studied Saul Alinsky and taught him for several years at the Saul Alinsky Institute.
Author Brandon House, who organizes Worldview Weekend conferences, often speaks on the influence of Saul Alinsky.
That phrase changed was his campaign slogan.
We're going to change this country and change the world.
We need change, real change.
Change has not come fast enough.
That's found on almost every page of Rules for Radicals. The word community organizer comes from Saul Alinsky's book. And by change, Saul Alinsky means a revolution. Saul Alinsky said we need to have a socialist, communist revolution. We need to do away with private property, free enterprise, free market, capitalism. And he says, but we do it over time, and we do it by penetrating every institution and changing their worldview. We pit the haves against the have-nots. We get the class envy going. We also stir up, very sadly what they've done today, racial disharmony.
Alinsky's influence even helped to create ACORN, the nation's largest urban activist organization. Successful lawsuits against ACORN have found it guilty of subverting the electoral process.
The organization ACORN was born out of the Saul Alinsky model, which today ACORN, is making national news for being involved in all kinds of things, from voter fraud to welfare fraud to all kinds of things. But there are many organizations like ACORN, and they're getting federal money, these organizations. Much of the stimulus money has been used for a personal slush fund, in my opinion, to use for these community organizing organizations.
While many people want to resolve conflict and controversy, Saul Alinsky relished it as a way to achieve power.
First rule of change is controversy. Change means movement, and movement means friction, and friction means heat, and heat means controversy.
Alinsky's influence was made obvious early on in Obama's presidency by his staff.
You never want a serious crisis to go to waste.
When it comes to the economic crisis, don't waste it. It can have a very positive impact.
Another rule for radicals that Saul Alinsky articulated was to use ridicule. He said, "Ridicule is man's most potent weapon. It is almost impossible to counterattack ridicule. Also, it infuriates the opposition, who then react to your advantage."
Now people say, gee, who did they use this tactic against? Well, Sarah Palin. Here she is, immensely popular, probably one of the most popular modern political figures, and they have taken this attitude of singling out and trying to ridicule her.
I can see Russia from my house.
Mother, moose hunter, bridge to nowhere supporter, ethics committee dodger, Alaska secession booster.
Alinsky also believed that you could achieve your radical goals by demonizing the opposition. He states, pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. The real action is in the enemy's reaction. The enemy, properly goaded and guided in his reaction, will be your major strength. Tactics, like life, require that you move with the action.
And you see that happening today where the administration is going after people that disagree with them. You have the former TSA nominee who's withdrawn now saying that, hey, the big threat to America is people who are anti-abortion and anti-government. Well, what does he really mean? People who are pro-life and who are conservative and are not for big government.
The Bible says that righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is reproach to any people. So what can we do to combat the influence of Saul Alinsky?
This is a biblical worldview battle. So how do we fight back? We fight back by teaching biblical worldview. What does the Bible say about law, science, economics, history, family, social issues, education, religion?
While Saul Alinsky and his followers would appear to be motivated by caring for the poor, critics charge that what they really want is political power, and they will use any means necessary to seize it.
You take on the persona of being for the people, when reality is you're only for yourself, you're only for power. Because reality is you're destroying the people, you're stealing their wealth, you're creating chaos.
Well, now, Bob, when you look at Saul Alinsky, he's claiming that he's all about justice, social justice. And the Bible says that we should have justice, justice for the poor. So what's your take on that?
Well, helping the poor is one thing. Taking money from other people to increase government power in the name of the poor is another thing entirely, and that's what Saul Alinsky and the radical rulers in place now are all about. They want to use the poor as their pawns, basically, to increase the power of government, to increase taxes, to increase regulations, and say, well, we're doing it to better the people who can't look out for themselves. So they start with a good motive, one that is biblically sound, and then they pervert it into an excuse for lording power over everybody else.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Bob.
Well, thanks for having me on, Jerry.
The information we've just heard is not being widely told in the mainstream media, and certainly not with a biblical worldview in mind. Yet patriotic Americans must know what is really going on in this administration and where its appointees are trying to take America. We hope you found this video informative and that you'll share it with others in your sphere of influence. God bless you as you do, and may God bless America.